Good morning. I'm grateful for everyone's presence this morning. Appreciate your energetic entrance into worship this morning. Want to welcome our visitors, of course. You are very honored guests of ours, and we're grateful for you being here. We hope that we can be an encouragement to you, especially in the ways of the Lord. And if we can answer any questions for you about the Lord, His work, and how you might be a part of it in this area. If you live here, please don't hesitate to ask. I've made it known to some of you that I was recently asked to tailor an upcoming meeting to the needs of a congregation that is reeling from the loss of 3 of its members in the last couple of months, only one of whom was expected. And the elders asked me specifically for comfort and encouragement in this difficult time. But I'm not asking you just to bear with me or be a guinea pig in this case, because as I thought about it, we're not a congregation that doesn't know a thing or two about suffering and hardship. Our Northern Kentucky family has recently lost loved ones, either to death or to having to move away. We've lost really good friends who've had to move away for one reason or another. We've had accidents, endured very painful physical ailments. We've been diagnosed with diseases, undergone surgeries, and that's not even to mention all those who are suffering and who are not even showing signs of that. They may be suffering as yet unseen and unknown. So this morning I want to talk about suffering and our response to it. And there are 2 extreme responses, I think both of which need to be avoided. Of course, the first one, on the one hand, would be the sufferer who, in his suffering, renounces his faith. He turns away from God. He blames God for his suffering. This is like the one whose stony-hearted reception of the gospel is immediate, and yet when tribulation comes, he immediately falls away. On the other hand, there is the man who believes that every awful thing that has happened to him in his life comes from God. But he consoles himself or others by assigning a specific reason for which God must be doing this thing. And so he has prescribed the reason for his pain. It's often the explanation offered by well-meaning, spiritually minded people. And you totally understand the appeal to want to do that. We want to know why. We want to find out the reason for our pain and the answer to our adversity. But that in and of itself is the problem. We're not given a reason for why. We're given a number of possible reasons for why, but we can't necessarily know for sure. In fact, Job, as you know, asked that question lots of times. And why is this happening? In fact, he in chapter 9, verse 17, said that it was happening to him without a cause. And in chapter 13, he basically pleads to God, saying, would that you would just kind of, would that you would just set all of this aside for a second. In verse 22 of Job 13, call and I will answer. Let me speak to you, then you respond to me, and you can let me know why all this is happening. You tell me about my iniquities, and what do you get after this Job's despondent's prayer? That's how my Bible titles this. Job despondently prays. Let's just have a conversation about this. He gets to the end of his prayer, and there's just a bunch of crickets, right? It's just no response whatsoever. Well, what if Job had been given a response? What if God had taken him under his wing and said, let me just explain what is happening here? If Job had known what chapters 1 and 2 were all about, don't you think he would have done much better at handling all this? This is what made it so hard, was that he didn't know. If Job, one of the most righteous men who ever lived, was not given the right to some little divine insight into what's going on, then why should we think that we deserve any better, if not even Job received it? Romans chapter 11, verse 33 tells us that the ways of God, the mind of God, is unsearchable, past finding out. He says, oh, the depth, Romans 11, verse 33, oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. So why then do we try to figure it all out down to the T, say this is why this is happening? I know that I lost my job because God has something lined up much better. He needs me over. We ascribe all of these explanations. And we need to be careful about putting words into God's mouth. So if we can't know then for sure, what do we do? What are we supposed to do? We just kind of become stoic about the whole thing, this is what this terrible life is all about? No, I mean, just because we can't know for sure doesn't mean that God is left out of the equation in our minds. My title is The Place of Providence in Pain. And I don't want to suggest that, just as I've said in my introduction so far, that God caused every awful thing to happen. But we need to, just like it says in Romans concerning vengeance, leave room for the wrath of God. We need, when we're suffering, to leave room for the providence of God. We need to leave that door open. We need to contemplate the mere possibility. And when we do that, it helps. It helps us to consider and to live by faith in what God may be doing in our lives. You know what? That might not be something that some are content with, but it was something that great men and women of old contented themselves with knowing. Think, for example, of our first instance in Philemon. And what I want to do by these examples, I think I have 4 or 5 points here that I want to share with you that demonstrate the way that we can think about our suffering. And again, I mentioned Philemon as the first example. And I just want you to consider, why is it that Paul said to Philemon what he did here? Philemon, having lost a servant of his who ran away, maybe stole something on his way out. And this would have been a great personal cost to him. Slaves were expensive, and this was a terrible wrong that was committed against him. It was his property in those days. And so Paul explains it to him. Again, Onesimus is the slave who ran away, and yet he met Paul and ended up hearing the gospel and becoming a Christian. But he consoles Philemon by saying, perhaps he departed for a while for this purpose, that you might receive him forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother, especially to me, but how much more to you, both in the flesh and in the Lord. But even the slight takeaway from this being that he is going to be even a better man, now that he's a believer, but even more so than that, he is a brother in the Lord now. Maybe this is why all of this happened. Again, the inspired apostle does not say, this is why this happened. It would have made everyone feel a lot better if he could have said that. But he simply consoled him with the possibility that perhaps this is why this is happening. So I make application of that principle. In a person's life, let's say that something happens and they're experiencing financial difficulties in life. Can we apply the perhaps principle to financial difficulties? Think about the account after a recession, accounts don't look so good. The retirement took a big hit, as it did for some about 10 years ago. It's like, man, I deposited all this money, or just overnight watch these things plummet. Can I apply the perhaps principle to that? In Matthew chapter 19, Jesus said, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. In Matthew 19, at the very beginning, he asked that rich young ruler to go and sell all that he had, because Jesus recognized that his money was becoming an obstacle to his salvation, that he had many goods, and he loved those things, and he was unwilling to part from him. What if our being parted from our money is somehow a part of God's generous effort and attempt to disassociate our hearts from the love of those things? Is that possible? Can we say perhaps about that? and consider it a possibility? What if one's spouse left them for no reason? How horrific is that? How depressed and how sorrowful we would go about our days. But think about Matthew chapter 19, verses 11 and 12. What it says, can we apply the perhaps principle in that instance? What if this person, the kind of person that would leave you for no good reason, what if this person would become such an obstacle to your faith and your salvation that she became or he became a snare to you, and in your desire to please your spouse, your faith was faulted and you lost your soul? What if God allowed them to do that and they departed, and you, even having to become a eunuch for the sake of Christ, as he says in verse 12, some have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He who is able to accept it, let him accept it. That's a hard possibility, but perhaps this very trying circumstance is going to result in something very wonderful, the salvation of your soul. What about a death in the family? Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 2 tells us one of the outcomes of death and going specifically to the house of mourning is that we are made to consider that it is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart. Is it possible that God allowed for that person to be taken because of the effect that it needs to have on the living? The sobering that it needs to have on those who need to recognize their own mortality? Perhaps. Turn over, if you will, to Job chapter 33, verses 19 through 22. And it should encourage us to know that these words come from Elihu. And so we appreciate that God did not have anything negative to say like he did about Job's other friends. So we perk up a little bit more when Elihu speaks, who seems to speak somewhat more wisdom, even being a younger man. It says in verse 19, man is chastened with pain on his bed, and with strong pain in many of his bones, so that his life abhors bread, and his soul succulent food. His flesh wastes away from sight, and his bones stick out, which once were not seen. Yes, his soul draws near the pit, and his life to the executioners. Okay, so this is describing suffering. This will fit perfectly into our subject this morning. Why? We want to know why. Why is this man hurting so? Elihu helps us with that in verses 28 and 29. It says, he, God, will redeem his soul from going down to the pit, and his life shall see the light. Behold, God works all these things, twice, in fact, 3 times with a man, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. Possibilities, perhaps. Elihu said God is doing this to create a teaching environment here where he is saving his soul from the pit. He's enlightening his eyes. He's reminding him about his frailty. He's showing him his mortality. He's reminding him of the goodness of the Lord. All of these things God is working. We're not trying to assign exactly what's going on behind the scenes, but we're leaving the door open to the possibilities. Turn, if you will, to 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 14. Again, under the heading of our tribulation or suffering resulting in some great benefit, even our salvation. 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 14, tells the story of Elisha, a prophet of God. It picks up in verse 14. I want to read for you from verses 14 through, well, we'll just pick up where I guess we'll go as far as we need to. It says in verse 8, I guess to back up and give you a little context, there was a woman who every time Elisha would pass by, she would prepare a room for him. And because of the generosity and the benevolence, he wanted to do something good for her. And so he called her before himself, and it was determined that he would, by God, give her a son. And she was thrilled by this. And no, my Lord, she says in verse 16, do not lie to your maidservant. She just almost did not believe how excited she was about this. Finally, she got her son, and when he grew up, it says in verse 19 that he developed a headache or something like that. It said, my head, 2 Kings 4:19. So he said to his servant, carry him to his mother. When he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon and then died. This was something that Elisha had just offered to her. He thrilled her with this. He gave her new meaning in life, and now so soon her son was taken away from her. Terrible suffering. Why? Why would this happen? It's not fair. She runs and goes and chases after Elisha. In fact, Gehazi is sent as a messenger. What's going on? Kind of meets her halfway. And she's like, I'm fine. She's like, how are you? How is your husband? How's your son doing? Fine. We're fine. I don't want to talk to you. I have business with Elisha. So she keeps going, and she finds Elisha, and she said, what is this that has happened? Look, it says in verse 27, when she came to the man of God at the hill, she caught him by the feet, but Gehazi came near to push her away. That's why you don't deal with Gehazi, okay? He's pushing her away. Nope, let her alone, for her soul is in deep distress, and the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. That's a great verse, by the way. As an aside, the Lord has hidden this from his prophet. He didn't know. He didn't have revelation from the Lord about this thing. Kind of like Nathan when he said, yeah, David, go do what you want. God had hidden that from him as well. So he didn't know anything about this. When he found out about it, long story short, too late, right? No, long story short, he ends up going to the son, kind of stretches out over him, kind of breathes, puts his mouth over his mouth, and he is brought back to life. Okay, so fast forward to chapter 8, verses 3 through 6 of 2 Kings, chapter 8. Elisha had warned this woman in verse 1 about a famine that was coming. Get out of town, go somewhere for this famine. It will come upon the land for 7 years. So the woman arose and did according to the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and dwelled in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. And it came to pass at the end of 7 years that the woman returned from the land of the Philistines, and she went to make an appeal to the king for her house and for her land. She came back, and her land was apparently not available. And it was somebody living in her house. What? Somehow they've rezoned this thing, and she doesn't even own her land anymore. This could be trouble. Thanks saw Elisha getting her into trouble like that. Then the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, tell me, please, all the great things Elisha has done. Now it happened as he was telling the king how he had restored the dead to life, that there was the woman whose son he had restored to life, appealing to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, my lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son whom Elisha restored to life. And when the king asked the woman, she told him. So the king appointed a certain officer for her, saying, restore all that was hers and all the proceeds of the field from the day that she left the land until now. Are you not struck by the coincidence of all of this? Isn't that amazing? It just so happens that the king wants to know about what all Elisha has done, and Gehazi happens to be in his presence that day, and so does the woman, that's the day that she comes before the king. I mean, how often does one come before the king? And that just happens to be the matter of conversation at the moment. And it was because of that thing. It was because of her suffering, the kind of suffering that in her distress, her bitter anguish, she said, why did this have to happen? Look at how it blessed her. Look at how even in the pain, that pain was somehow able to result in her getting her land back. And not only her land back, but all the proceeds of the field from the day that she left until now. She's in a great position. All of this started, by the way, because she was a godly person who was trying to help the man of God, a prophet, by providing a place for him to turn in on his long journey. What if we could think like that? Again, not to say, I know what God is doing here, as if to say that every awful and terrible thing is a gift from God. No, we know it says every good and perfect gift is from God. Let's not assign every awful thing that happens to God or prescribe what God is doing here. But man, the scriptures are replete with examples that leave the door open that we should consider the possibility of providence in our pain. Also, our suffering could be the result of an omniscient God who's trying to spare us from ourselves, maybe perhaps even sparing us from the future. I mentioned this earlier in a lesson concerning why we sometimes get a no answer to our prayers. So we will not spend a lot of time talking about King Hezekiah, but God apparently had a plan, likely, that Hezekiah would be taken from this life 15 years before he was. And Hezekiah appeals to God based upon his righteousness and loyal heart, and it says that God heard his prayer in 2 Kings 20, verse 5. So he granted him an extra 15 years. The text is very careful to point out that this was not this was basically Hezekiah in the driver's seat. So much so that this man who had trusted in the Lord and seen the salvation of the Lord with 185,000 deaths of the Assyrians in one night by the angel of the Lord, this man who so trusted in the Lord now is asking for a sign that he might declare, that he might be persuaded that he can trust that God has surely heard his prayer. All of that perhaps to point out that this was not by chance, that this turnaround in his health was not by chance, and it wasn't perhaps even a part of God's original plan. Almost as if to say, Hezekiah, you're calling the shots here. How do you want this sign? Custom made. You want the shadow to go forward? Do you want the shadow to go back? Let's just point out here, this is Hezekiah in the driver's seat here. I'm hearing you because of your righteous and loyal heart, but this wasn't a part of the original plan. And we contemplate what might have been in the best interest of Hezekiah long term. Because you know that Hezekiah did not repay according to the kindness that was shown to him, as the scriptures say. And in his latter years, there was great trouble for him, and he made some foolish decisions. His heart was lifted up, and it did not go well. What if we could, even in a trying hour such as that, a diagnosis, even something that seems like it is going to be a sure thing, that God knows what is best for me, and he cares for me in my trial. Our suffering also may be to the end of the result in the glory of God. Okay, Job, again, not to spend a lot of time, but look at the glory of God that came through Job because of the, if you want to call it a contest between God and Satan. There was a lot on the line there. And Job was faithful, and Job did not curse God and die, as his wife had said. Think about John chapter 9 as an example of this. In John chapter 9, the blind man is said to not be responsible for this because of his or his parents' sin, but that the glory of God might be manifest in him. It might be revealed through this man's blindness. If he'd ever wondered about why he had to be born blind, Could you have, after the fact, you could have consoled this man. God has major plans for you. God is going to cause his glory to be seen in you. He's going to heal you of this. You couple this with Exodus chapter 3. It talks about God who makes the blind and gives man who is dumb he makes that man's tongue or that man's eyes, and he created a man in that way. And so if God chooses to do that and has a plan for his glory to be revealed, then that's more glory to God. Just like in the case of Mary and Martha in John chapter 11. Again, I hope you're seeing the pattern here of how much this happens with God's people. In John 11, verse 6, message was brought to him that the one whom Jesus loved was sick. In verse 6, it says, when he heard that he was sick, he stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. That decision right there is going to end up getting him confronted by both Mary and Martha later on in verses 21 and 32, where they say, Lord, if you had been here, he would not have died. Back up, look at verse 15, what Jesus says to his disciples about what was going to take place. He said, I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, and for your sakes I waited 2 more days, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. It's time, essentially. It's time. By the time we get there, he will have been dead for 3 days. 4 days. Sorry, verse 39. He will have been dead for 4 days. All of those things happen. All of that pain was allowed to be endured so that God could be glorified. The power of God could be seen in him. But you can't say he doesn't care. You can't say that he's indifferent to our pain. Jesus wept. He permitted the pain as if to say there is something even more important to me than making sure that we're all comfortable. And that was the glory of God's name. When Mary and Martha would have been saying something like the psalmist in Psalm chapter 10, verse 1, I thought of this as a perfect illustration. Why do you stand afar off, O Lord? Why do you hide in times of trouble? So why did you stay 2 more days? We know why. And my trial could be for the benefit of many others. I remember when I preached on the need to cut down the tree and forget about it recently. It kind of opened up to you about challenges that we've endured, and I want to credit Brother Ben for this encouraging point, because he pulled me aside and said, and you also need to consider that sometimes you suffer because it's a benefit to other people. And he had himself and all of you in mind when he said that. So I'm inserting this point because I think it's valid, scripturally speaking. Genesis chapter 45, 4 through 5. Speaking of a man who had been terribly distressed and betrayed by his brothers, listen to what Joseph was able to say to them. Genesis 45, verses 4 and 5 says, and Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. Just imagine the quivering that they must have been doing. So they came near. Then he said, and this is Genesis 45, verse 4, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. There was no bitterness here. He credited him with actually God being the one who did this in order to save life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which they will be neither plowing nor harvesting. Here's the reason number 2 why he said God allowed this to happen. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Not only did he save all of those lives in Egypt, but he also preserved a remnant among you, that is, sons of Jacob. For what? Basically, Joseph is understanding that God was using him to keep his promise that he made to Abraham. And by exalting him to the position that he had, he was putting Israel in a position to then, when the next Pharaoh arises, to become odious in his sight and eventually to leave Egypt, just as he had promised. So hard for us, though, to see this. We can't see this. Can you imagine if you could whisper in Joseph's ear in the pit or in the slave trading caravan headed to Egypt? Hey, just try to whisper God's plan at that point. He'll think you're crazy. There's no way that this is going to result in that. Why are all these examples given? Is God dead? Does he no longer deal with his people in these ways? Of course not. One of the things that consoles us is the statement in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It reads as such. We know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. That's a great promise. We should not fail to point out a few caveats about this promise. It's not a promise to the whole world. You can't go to your friend in the world and say, hey, let me help you understand what suffering is all about. God is doing something in your life. This is a promise for those who love God and those who are called according to his purpose. Second of all, it does not say that God is going to make each individual event have some great outcome. It's not that we can suffer some horrible thing and think there's going to be some amazing benefit to it. You just watch and see God did this so that some great thing will happen. We left the door open to that, the possibilities. But when we're 80, we may be able to look back on many awful things that happened, and if for no other reason, no other result, you say, yes, that was an awful thing that happened. We may say, the only thing I learned from that is perseverance, and that would be a credit for that as well. But we need to not lose sight of the fact that there is also a devil that is alive and well and working in this world. Satan causes and wreaks a lot of havoc in our lives. But what we can do, and what we should also understand about this, is to understand that not every good thing that results from the adversity that we suffer is going to be enjoyed in this life. I want you to see a parallel to this promise that is made in 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. Keep in mind what this well-known promise that God makes, everything good to come about or work together for those who are called. Peter says something similar, but he points out it's not always in this life that happens. He says in this, 1 Peter 1 verse 6, in this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while, if need be, you've been grieved by various trials, that the genuineness of your faith, being much more precious than gold that perishes, through it, though it is tested by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Even if we can't look back on everything and see, oh, God had some amazing providential plan there. This is how we can know that everything will work together one day, like puzzle pieces in a puzzle. Everything eventually will work together for good, even if it not in this life, but in the life to come, that it will result in the praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. What I'm just asking you to do in conclusion this morning is to, like James said, remember the perseverance of Job and consider the end intended by the Lord. Consider the great end that he has in mind, that he is very compassionate and merciful. We might not know the end at the beginning, but we can know that he is compassionate and merciful, and we take confidence in the end that has been demonstrated time and time again for his people. I wish I could give all of you and myself answers for everything, but we're left with the exhortation of Obadiah. The righteous shall live by his faith, even when we don't understand what is happening. Appreciate your kind attention. It's all that I've prepared for you this morning. I hope that if you're not suffering at the moment, that this will something that you'll tuck away and consider when it is needed, that you might be prepared or equipped for that day, because it's coming. If you believe Elihu, it's coming to all of us. The dark day will come. So appreciate again your attention. We're going to sing a song of encouragement at this time. I want to remind you of that great promise. Those who love God, those who are called according to his purpose, they have the promise that all things will work together for good. If you're not a child of God, if you've not yet responded in faith, obedience, confession, repentance, baptism, all of these commands, you've not identified yourself as one having been chosen by God, but you can do that and show that God is truly one who has chosen you for salvation, as Revelation says, from the foundation of the earth. If you're subject to that invitation, we can help you to fulfill his commands. Come forward now while we stand and sing.